Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to another episode of The Ways We Move, the podcast that highlights innovative mobility solutions. My name is Nicolas Zart, and I am your host on this podcast where we actually talk about various forms of innovative mobility solutions. What I mean by that is the new transportation modes that are being conceived of, but more than being conceived of, they're actually being worked on. And today's guest is probably I'm so excited because I really like this person a lot. He is so knowledgeable. He's poised. He's done a really good job at the Federal Aviation Agency, the FAA in the US. He's thoughtful. He is by trade an engineer. He started on the heliport side of things, so he understands operations and the infrastructure side of things. And he broke the news here on this podcast for the first time, actually for the second time that we've had a scoop. And can you guess? It is Robert Bassey. And Robert, I've been hearing Robert for many years now, about 5 or 6 years. And it always struck me how really great this person is, both on stage and off stage. Robert's depth of knowledge and expertise in aviation and specifically in advanced air mobility is impressive. So he talks about obviously his background, what he does at the FAA, and what the FAA has been doing, making this whole concept of advanced air mobility a reality on the infrastructure side of things, on the operational side of things, in the ecosystem part of it. But he also, Scoop, said that he is transitioning to a private company and he will be more or less doing the same things, but on the private side of things. And I was very intrigued the whole time thinking, who is he going with? But then after our call, he said that he would be working with a company that it wasn't exactly who I thought it was in the beginning. Anyway, without blabbering on too much, I'm very excited about this podcast with Robert because I've asked him to be on the show for a while now. And I hope you enjoy it because you'll get a sneak peek as to what is happening at the FAA, what is happening also even behind the scenes, which is of course very public, but also their relationship with the European EASA and ICAO and much more. In fact, so many much more things that at the end I told him, I said, you have to come back for two reasons. I didn't ask you all the other questions I wanted to ask you, but also because I want you to come back once you made your transition and talk about what you're doing. So without further ado, let's hear from Robert, who is going to tell us a little bit about his past experience at the FAA and where he is going to now. And again, please like, share, subscribe. Tell us what you think. We're breaking through the 850 downloads, and we're close to 1,000 downloads, which I hope we'll celebrate before the end of the year. I'm pretty sure we will. Thank you, and let's hear from Robert. Well, hey, Robert, thank you for being with us today. Let's have Robert introduce himself. Who is Robert?
So Robert Bassey is a long-standing participant in the AAM industry. I've been involved, at least from the regulatory side, pretty much since inception. Prior to my work, which I'll get into shortly, as far as AAM standards development, I had prior experience working on research and technology and a lot of engineering projects in support of aviation standards and technology. But as recently as 2016, 2017, I took on the heliport design portfolio for the FAA, and that segued into vertiport design somewhere about, I would say, 2019, when a lot of the industry buzz around the AAM topic began to percolate. And essentially, I've been managing that portfolio, the vertiport design portfolio within the FAA now for the last 6 years. I've helped author two of the design standards, national design standards for vertiport design. Currently working on a performance-based standard that would be essentially the next shoe to drop, if you will, in terms of standards development and trying to pivot from what has been a prescriptive or compliance-based standard when we think about designing for these facilities in the past to what I hope would be a design standard that's more based on performance outcomes than just purely prescriptive criteria. On a personal note, I will be breaking some news here in that I am also in the midst of a transition from my role in the public sector to taking on a position in the private sector, leading AAM strategy for a private sector company, as well as taking on other AAM related initiatives. So I see that as really transitioning from defining the rules, as I've done for the last 6 years, to really now helping to operationalize and scale those rules. And leveraging a lot of the institutional knowledge and ecosystem knowledge that I've gleaned over the course of my time at the FAA, and using that now to help the ecosystem scale safely, sustainably, and efficiently.
Wow, Robert. First of all, congratulations. Yeah, you deserve it. You've been putting in a lot of time, a lot of hours into it. And thank you for breaking the news on the ways we moved. I mean, we really appreciate that a lot. I just want to say to people who are watching us, listening to us, is that I've enjoyed hearing you talk for so many years. And I always found you to be very, very astute, very knowledgeable, but to really understand the whole ecosystem around it too. So a transition from the regulatory body part of it to now the private sector of it. I mean, it's a shoehorn. You're going to be perfect for whatever you do. Can't wait to hear who it will be that you will be joining, because man, there are getting some top-notch expertise with you on board. So congratulations, and thanks for saying it over here. I really mean that.
Thank you.
And also, I didn't know that you had started on the heliport side of things and then you transitioned to the vertiport side of things. I know you've been around for a long time in this industry, and you're right, 2016, 2017, that's when things were starting to bubble up. 2017, we have Uber Elevate, we have NASA also all of a sudden coming up with advanced air mobility, the coining the term advanced air mobility, which in its original version is way, way, way bigger than what we do here. So this is really interesting, and I'm glad to have you here today. Tell us a little bit about, because you mentioned a few things that we, of course, on the infrastructure side of things, we're always reading about, and that's the executive brief EB 105. We've seen EB 105A, which is a revision of the original one. Now we're getting into obviously EB 105B. If you can tell us a little bit about this, and then the follow-up question to that is, when are we going to have a circular? And I'm not holding you up to it, obviously, but we're all waiting for that, because now, just to give you the background stories, is between what OEMs say, what infrastructure knows, and what the public wants to hear. There's a lot of there are a lot of things that need to mesh together, and I think you're the right person to talk about all these things.
So EB 105 really stemmed from a need to fill a gap that existed at the time. Now, if EB 105 was released essentially back in 2022, but the research that led up to that really began in earnest in 2019. And if you go back to 2019, the ecosystem was very, I would say, fragmented, and there were not a lot. There were a lot of concepts, there were a lot of prototypes, there were a lot of ideas, but it was very immature. So we had to develop a technical and operational foundation right in the midst of that. So the way I think of it is that's that interim framework that we put out that allowed industry to have a sense of what is the design framework and the safety framework that the FAA is stipulating, that would allow innovation to be built within that framework. What are the boundaries, right? And within which we will allow innovation to ultimately take off. But to do that, given that we were operating in an environment where there was a lack of data, right? You can't build vertiports in isolation. It's part of an ecosystem.
No,
So you
it's
need
part
to
of the ecosystem.
understand what's the vertical design, does this integrate into the airspace? How will the community accept this or integrate this into their everyday life? How does the ground traffic integrate with this as well? So you have to think about it as an ecosystem. And given that the vehicle designs were, again, very immature, there was a lack of validated performance data, we had to
Yes.
develop what was really very conservative guidance around what a vertiport should look like in terms of its landing area sizing, its geometry, the size of the safety zones, how does it deal with energy management, and those sorts of questions. So that was done very conservatively, with the idea that over the next few years, we're going to collect some operational testing data, working with the OEMs, and then iterate on that guidance to get something that is more tailored to particular vehicle design and the environments in which those vehicles will be operating. And that's what we tried to do with EB105A. It was an evolution from EB105 based on the data that we were able to glean working hand in glove with the OEMs for the subsequent 2 years. So EB105 went more in a performance-based direction,
Yeah.
right? And that allowed us to shrink, in certain cases, the size of the landing facilities. It allowed us to think more, astutely about how do we make sure that the approach departure paths around the vertiport are clear, and those sorts of questions. The difficulty even in that was we have OEMs, and a lot of them are focused on myriad of activities. They're focused on certification. Seems to be the main priority, and understandably so, right? So getting access to the aircraft to support our testing was a bit challenging, right? So we were only able to collect a limited amount of data in order to achieve EB105A. Now, where do we go beyond EB105A? A performance-based AC that incorporates not just eVTOLs, but also traditional rotorcraft, right? It bridges the gap between traditional rotorcraft and this next generation of electric and hybrid vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. And that's what we're trying to achieve, but in a performance-based way. So we want to shift from, like I said, what has been a compliance and prescriptive approach to design standards to one that's based on performance outcomes. So what do I mean by that? Prescriptive would be, okay, here's what the touchdown area size needs to be, right? Here's what the lighting pattern around the facility needs to look like. We want to get away from that. We want to get to a place where we're actually stipulating safety outcomes. Here are the safety margins that we are seeking. Here are the landing precision targets that we're seeking. Here are the energy sustainability targets that we're seeking, and allow industry to innovate within those parameters and tailor solutions based on their aircraft and the environment. And that's what ultimately we're looking to achieve by way of the AC, and do that for rotorcraft and eVTOL alike. But now we're not going to get there in the first iteration fully. It's going to be a bit of a process. So we think of EB105 as the blueprint, the design framework, and then the AC as the living playbook, if you will, for how we move things forward from a prescriptive to a fully performance-based direction.
Wow, it's really interesting what you're saying, because it really sounds like you guys went from a very theoretical, conceptual point of view of how this could operate. And you're right, by the way, by saying it, because I remember back when I switched over, it was somewhere in 2014, 15. Yeah, we had, great plans of flying from building tops to building tops and eventually landing on a parking lot. Well, lo and behold, none of them are made for that, especially for multiple hour use or anything like that. So, of course, right around 2017, there's a reckoning moment where we realize, we need something a little bit more fleshed out. So, you were right, it's very immature. But it sounds like the FAA did the right thing of first seeing it from a conceptual point of view, and then coming down with a little bit more serious guidelines. But at the same time, and this is, I think, where the brilliance is of EB105, is you're also letting the industry innovate within those parameters. So this is a really fine balance to strike, whereas you have those guidelines and within that, innovate all you want. That's fantastic.
Exactly.
Tell us a little bit about so this is something I've been, Rex Alexander very well. He's a close friend of mine and everything. So for the last few years, we've been talking about when and if EB105 will start to include what I think is one of the makes the perfect most sense for vertiports, STOL ports, and especially eSTOL ports. Because I was at Oshkosh and I was looking at that beautiful long runway, and wow, they can land three airplanes at the same time. And all of a sudden it dawned on me that, we could have multiple T-lofts inside of that runway, and even the ones on in the middle with a FATO yay big, so that when eventually eVTOLs grow to be 40 seaters, if that really will happen, I'm sure it will happen, then their approach is going to be much, much wider. So is this something that the FAA has been looking into? Because to me, especially on the infrastructure side of things, because we're the glue that bonds it all together. Vertiports, in and of themselves, by themselves, that's a hard financial case scenario to make. But now a STOL port means that I can have eSTOLs land, some small electric airplanes land, but also eVTOLs and everything. And then, of course, get them out of the way to charging points and passenger pickup points. What do you think of all that? Where are we going in that direction? I hope.
We absolutely are. So this is something that the FAA has been looking at. Going into the AC, part of our agenda was to kind of holistically address the stall port concept within that vertical flight infrastructure AC, as we call it. The issue we've run into, as has been in the past working with OEMs, and because our design standards are in some ways dependent on the operational timelines for the OEMs, for the vehicle manufacturers, we're working with I'm not to be unnamed stall aircraft manufacturers and their certification timelines and the timelines to getting to actual conforming aircraft that we can actually test and understand their performance capabilities more fully has slipped. And so as a result of that, we have to kind of push out the guidance, the technical and operational guidance for a landing facility that will be based on the performance capabilities of that aircraft out into the future. So we're going to make a notable mention of stall ports in the next advisory circular. But what I would anticipate is that as those vehicles become more, again, I'll use the word mature, right? And we get to conforming aircraft that we can actually assess and more fully validate their performance capabilities, then we would see in the next iteration of the advisory circular more fleshed out guidance around stall ports. But that's definitely the direction that the agency is going.
Well, that is great news because to me it makes so much more sense. And I was speaking with, you probably know him very well, Mark Osman at Electra, about watching what the Goldfinch did, but also what the EL9 can do. And we basically came up with the idea that, 400 feet runway, let's say 500 with plenty of safety margins, and you have an eSTOL like the EL function really well. And then theoretically, well, you can have TLOFs in it for regular eVTOLs. So that would be a fantastic thing to look into. And for people who might not be aware of, is STOL ports have been, I mean, the FAA had a circular, I think back in the 70s, if I remember well, and the military has been operating STOL ports since the 80s. So it's nothing new. Again, this is really a convergence of lots of old ideas, but you guys are bringing it into the advanced air mobility arena. So this is really good news to hear. I'm excited to hear that.
That's correct. I mean, like you said, it's conceptually it's nothing new. I think the innovation lies in the aspects of it that don't fit the typical airport model. So when you talk about electric, autonomous, high frequency operations, I think that's where the differentiation lies, and that's how what we're trying to ultimately integrate into our kind of design standard for these emerging entrants.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's all about how do we make the conceptual real at one point or another. Also another things that we've been talking a lot, but we don't always talk about it very publicly, is the idea of where are we going to fly first. And there's a lot of things that we hear that sort of raises our eyebrows, make us scratch our head. I used to have hair, by the way, when I started this 10 years ago. But we hear a lot of companies saying we're going to fly over New York City, Dallas, Los Angeles, Paris, London. And the first thing that comes up for us on the infrastructure side of things, and I'm sure for you guys on the regulatory body, is you're going to fly over millions of people over their heads. That's going to take a long time to do, a lot of certification, a lot of proving and everything. And so a lot of us have been thinking, the real demand, which may or may not have been voiced or even recognized yet, as far as commuters are concerned, is more the urban and suburban environments. I wanted to take your point of view on that one because again, what we see on the press release is what we see here in the infrastructure world, which I think is a little bit more grounded in reality because we have to figure out how to do it right. And then what the public wants is there's always a little bit of a lag. So what do you guys think about the first few flights? Where will they be? Where does it make the most sense to fly? And then I'll lead up to something else
Yeah,
later.
you're touching on a big motivation for my transition from the FAA into the private sector is, I think there's a lot of I see working with the OEMs and working with infrastructure providers and you know other stakeholders in the industry over the last few years. I see there's a lot of confusion, if you will, around what the design intent is and how is that compatible with the technical realities on the ground. And my hope is to help bridge that gap, right? Because you're absolutely right. There's a lot of, I'll say, marketing around
It's true.
business models and use cases. that don't quite line up with one, the design intent, the technical realities on the ground. I think ultimately urban areas, right, make the most sense, at least in the interim. Connecting vertiports to existing transit nodes, rail links, extending airports out, right, connecting them to terminals at airports, right, connecting them to mobility hubs, electric vehicle hubs. These things make sense because at the end of the day, we're not just designing for technical to address technical questions. We're designing to address public trust and public acceptance. So without a design model that factors into its thinking, how would the public accept this or interface with this or integrate this into their everyday life? We're designing in a vacuum, right? Right, and it all ultimately doesn't meet the light of day, which is what happens with a lot of these concepts that have come across my desk over the last few years. So I 100% agree. I think the urban landscape makes a lot of sense. It'll still require, kind of building an ecosystem around all the aspects that would kind of make that future possible, beyond just the landing at facility. Again, how does this integrate into the airspace? How do we deal with the community integration? How do we deal with the ground traffic? How do we deal with energy systems? How does this stabilize or cause the grid to be unstable? If how do we work around that? How do we deal with fire and safety issues? So there's a lot of issues here that need to be grappled with, that I think lend themselves, at least in the interim, in the initial stages, to the urban and suburban landscape. With I would say with an emphasis on connecting these landing facilities to airports terminals, linking them with transit nodes, linking them with existing transportation hubs, and that can facilitate some sort of multimodal integration in the near term.
Yeah, you said a lot of great things in there, and I don't even know where to start. But I have my fingers like I've got 3 points I have to remember from what you said. But I was one of those people. I was a journalist for 20 years who wrote a lot of these press releases, and the whole time I was scratching my head, going, this is not communication anymore, guys. We've crossed the boundaries into marketing. We really got to start first with communication, then we can get into marketing, not the other way around. It doesn't work that way. But I think you're totally right. Also, I think you made a really great point. I was working very closely with SkyDrive up until this year, and I think SkyDrive has done an incredible job at giving us one of the potentials of advanced air mobility, which is again what you're alluring to, that convergence of mobility. Connecting all the dots of these mobility points. They've been working with the local railroad companies, with the local metro companies, and that is something I find absolutely amazing that needs to happen because on the vertiport, multi-port side of things, when I think of a place that, short of everything we have to think of, one of the first thoughts is, where are the closest public transportation? What does it look like? Where are the closest highways? What is, by the way, the closest substation? Because let's not even get into the energy debate right now. We'll get into it a little bit later. But, are there any maritime routes around here? And then, of course, everything that goes around that. Where is light rail? Do we have heavy rail around that? And how do we connect all these points together? And we had another person pretty well also, is Clint Harper, who not only has a lot of experience running military airports, but also is an urban planner by trade. And that was one of the conversations that we end up having, is also the role of regional airports, which have been sort of shunned up until now. A lot of the wonderful prop airplanes have been replaced for longer haul, which going to close down some routes. So now we're reopening these routes, but also we're reopening these dots in between, the business centers, the tourist centers, all of that. And I think you said it really well. And for me, the low hanging fruit is actually where urban air mobility started in the 50s, right? UAM, the hardcore of UAM was to connect these underserved spots. It wasn't to connect Boston to New York
Right.
or, San Diego to LA. It was really to connect those places that had not been connected with a highway network. So I think we're not only getting back to that, but we're also broadening the envelope in a way that's, I think it's taken a lot of us by surprise.
I would agree.
So tell us a little bit more about how do you see the next few years unfolding right now? Because we've sort of went, and this is just my personal take, we went through the very exuberant first years of, wow, this is, the best things since sliced bread. A lot of early investors, which may or may not have been the best thing for the industry. A lot of them I find were not very savvy. You know, in aviation, the rule of thumb is a decade, $1 billion, and 1,000 engineers, and you can't ask for returns on profit a year or two later. That just doesn't work this way. But now it seems like there's been a bit of a lull. It's not on the investment side of things, but a lot of things that are happening behind the scenes, and I think a lot of people don't know that. So a lot of people are sort of getting tired of advanced air mobility, but I'm still excited because there's so many things happening that we just don't always talk about because maybe they're not as sexy. What do you think is happening right now, and what do you think will be happening in the next few years as you transition?
Yeah, I think the first few years were really characterized by a lot of noise and buzz and marketing. I'll use that word again, around the topic, and I think a lot of that kind of has fallen by the wayside, and I think that's okay. I think if I go back to 2019, 2020, I think Vertical Flight Society at the time was tracking over 1,000 concepts for vehicle designs.
Yep.
Much of them have, again, not materialized, and I think that's okay. We're seeing a consolidation in terms of OEMs and the design concepts that are viable, and that's just the normal trajectory of a kind of a new and nascent industry, right? I think where we are right now, we've moved beyond the prototypes. We're really into the planning phase. I think we're in the infrastructure and integration phase of AAM. We're seeing a lot of municipalities and developers map out vertiport networks. And I think the huge unlock is going to be the advisory circular. I
Yes.
think once there is a national design standard that is based on performance outcomes that allows industry to innovate, and it's a clear signal to developers, infrastructure providers, energy networks that this is the standard, right? This is the reliable standard that you can scale. Then I think we're going to see these networks that are being planned right now start to develop and start to evolve into real projects, and I think those projects will then kind of galvanize the industry into its next kind of operational phase. I think the other part that I would anticipate, not within the next year, but sooner than most people think, because I think people have kind of overstated this in the other direction, and I understandably so because of the delays, is the certification of certain aircraft.
Yes.
I think once these aircraft get certified, which timing wise is going to be seems to be kind of tracking alongside the publication of the advisor circular. I think
Yes.
both of those two events, at least in the US, will again galvanize the next phase where we'll go from the infrastructure planning and integration phase that we're in right now with a lot of municipalities again mapping out what these networks will look like into actual implementation, right? Into the operationalization of these standards and these aircraft. And then the big ask on us as industry stakeholders is to get public buy-in,
Yes.
right?
Absolutely.
How is to get the public to accept this new transportation model, and that's on us. We have to make the case for it. We have to integrate it into existing communities. We have to make sure that these vertiports interface safely into a city. We have to make sure that the environmental impacts of these vertiports are minimized in terms of noise, in terms of the visual noise, in terms of the heated footprint of these aircraft. Those are all things that I think will need to be resolved within the next couple of years as far as how we best do that. But I think all of those things will ultimately lead to an ecosystem that will actually take off. I think we overpromised in the beginning, and that tends to happen. And so I think people are a little jaded right now, but that's okay. But I think there's certain real milestones. I just named a few of them that
Yep.
we're on the precipice of, and once those materialize, we're going to see an industry actually take off, and the people that have positioned themselves to take advantage of that, liftoff, will be the ones kind of in the bird seat.
Yeah, you raise a lot of good points in there. One of them is, I think one of your colleagues said it very well. People see noise much more than they hear it. There's an airplane, it's going to be loud. There's a helicopter, it's going to be loud. So We got to go beyond. And one thing that I've been pushing also for the last few years is let's not ask for acceptance, because I'm not begging for acceptance. This is the coolest thing that's happened for 100 years. Let's ask for desirability. We can take a note from Steve Jobs when he introduced the iPhone, and mea culpa. I was like, why would I want to watch a movie on an iPhone? But you know what? The iPad, then I was like, oh yeah, I totally get it. Maybe the desirability, the coolness factor is really one thing that we need to focus on. And we're coming up with, pedagogical supports or visual supports. I think Clint would frown at me because I'm not supposed to say pedagogical when it comes to adults, but those are very important things to start to work on. And you're right. I think that's important. Another thing too that I wanted to talk about, and there's two things I want to talk about. I hope I remember both of them, but you mentioned certifications, and it's true. We keep on hearing about a lot of, hey, we're going to be certified this year, we're going to be certified next year. But I think there's different types of certifications the public may not be aware of. And loosely bundled up, we can kind of bundle up into two certifications. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I look at it is there's prototype certification and all that it implies, and then there's operational certification. And both of them are very different. This part, yeah, I think most companies can pretty much achieve it, at least on the financial side of things. But the operational certification, that's years down the road, a lot of data, and billions of dollars down the road. I'd like to hear your point of view on all of that, because it might help maybe set the record a little straight as to maybe not hope for things to fly out of the box tomorrow.
Yeah, I think you hit just certification in terms of meeting technical requirements, and that that's kind of going through its process right now. A lot of the hold up, logjam we've seen with that, some of it has to do with the FAA initially trying to figure out what are the requirements against which we want to technically certify these aircraft, and kind of developing that in real time. But also is now it seems to be the aircraft themselves being evolved enough to actually meet those requirements. And
Yes.
so that song and that dance is very much underway. But I think it will ultimately culminate in a couple of aircraft at the very least being certified in the near future. But then the operational readiness of these aircraft, that's a different ball of wax, and that will take longer. But I also think it's not something that we should think is going to ultimately get in the way of the ecosystem kind of taking
Yes.
off,
Good
right?
point. Yeah.
Right. So we shouldn't be scared of operational readiness, right? And in that process of assessing that, it's important to point out, as you did, that there is a difference there between the technical and performance certification of the aircraft in terms of is this aircraft safe to fly versus the operational readiness of the aircraft, which is a more protracted process and involved process. But also, I think it's an enabling process, right, that
Right.
we should ultimately embrace.
Yeah, I think you said it really well. One really leads to the next one. Once we know that the aircraft is safe, can handle so many hours of flight, nothing falls out, nothing, everything works accordingly, then we can start to look at the entire ecosystem, including the infrastructure, and then we can make sense of it. So I thank you for clarifying that, because I think that again, sometimes it tends to be a little bit more on the marketing. We're going to be certified next year, and people think, oh, we can fly next year. Well, no, there's still a lot of this is aviation, guys. This is not, well, I shouldn't say automotive, but I mean, automotive is way easier in one sense. It's a 2D problem, whereas we have a 4D problem in this industry. Another question I wanted to ask you is also a lot of confusion out there for those who know a little bit more is the differences between what the FAA says and maybe what ICAO also says, right? So there's a lot of standards and certification process at the ICAO level. Some airports may want to follow some of the ICAO guidelines or not. And so, how do you see this evolving in the future? Because on the European side, it's pretty straightforward. We're pretty much EASA and Eurocontrol, but in the US, it's really complicated. We've got DOT, we got FAA, we've got then the state level, the so on and so forth. So how do you see ICAO and FAA working closer, or maybe I don't know how that is panning out. So I'd like to hear your point of view on that.
Great question. I tell, even as I transition out from kind of public policy, I'm kind of mentoring people to kind of step into my shoes. One of the big things I've been advocating is you need to come in here with bridge building mindset and not
Yes.
look to operate in a silo. Collaboration is key, right? Particularly in this industry. So part of my role for the last 5 years has been that liaison between the FAA and ICAO
Yeah.
on the topic of vertiport design. So, and with the goal ultimately of trying to harmonize internationally as best we can. So, one of the big matter of fact, I have a meeting scheduled with ICAO next week on particularly this topic to discuss harmonization, right? Because the goal is maybe not to be a facsimile of ICAO or vice versa, but where we can be consistent and harmonize around design standards and signal kind of uniformity to the industry, I think is important. I think my counterparts on the ICAO side would agree. So we are in communication on that all the time. We don't always hit the marks on every single design requirement, but those conversations are happening. Similar with EASA, with their design specification, we have had technical interchanges with them on a fairly regular basis. One big area where we did work together, I'll just point to one of our successes, was around the idea of how do we mark a vertiport.
Oh,
Initially
yes.
EASA had the V and we had the broken wheel symbol. And we did some collaborative research to determine what the best identification marking for vertiport needs to be. And then we settled on the heliport H as the more effective symbol, and also a symbol that kind of maintains consistency
Yes.
with what the pilots and operators and designers are already familiar with, and that's something that ICAO, IASA most specifically, has agreed with, and that's being also co-opted within the ICAO framework. So we're part and parcel of those discussions, and that I intend to continue to on that, even from the private sector, in terms of advisory boards and working groups with internationally, to continue to help influence that and make sure that we're not again designing in a vacuum. That design intent is thinking about the technical realities on the ground, and that we are harmonized internationally as best we can.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that about EASA because that was going to be my follow-up question is, how closely are you guys working together? Because it sounds like, yeah, in the beginning, both FAA and EASA had very different philosophies and it sort of seems to be bridging there. And of course, the other one to bring into the consideration is ICAO. So you've answered all of these questions in a way that makes me feel really happy about that. And I'm more and more intrigued about where you're going. I have a few thoughts in my mind, but we'll see. We'll see about where you will land. But I've already crossed out one company out of the equation. And also, I wanted to find out: will you be in Palo Alto? Are you near Palo Alto in right now, or I don't know where you're located?
So I'm in DC. I'm at
You are in DC, of
I'm
course.
close to FAA headquarters.
Yeah.
Yes.
I was hoping to see you at the eVTOL show in what it's coming up in a few days. I'll be chairing the session on Thursday. It would have been great to have seen you over there. So right now, usually we get into the more personal aspect of why are you in this industry? What gets you out of bed in the morning? So tell us, Robert, why are you doing this? Are you crazy? You could have a job somewhere else, pay your rent, pay your mortgage, and just have an easy life. You've chosen something that is pretty difficult, a futurist conceptualization into practicality. Tell us about what's your driving motivation.
I think for me, the challenge of figuring out this new transportation model and ecosystem has been deeply rewarding, and frankly, it's what gets me out of bed in the morning because we're not trying to just design and address technical questions. We're trying to build an ecosystem that the public would ultimately trust, find safe, and integrate into their everyday life, and that's exciting for me. So, um, I kind of took this on without fully knowing what I was getting into back
Don't we
in the
all?
early days. Yeah, exactly. I wasn't quite. What is a vertiport? It sounds like a heliport. I know what a heliport is, but and then I just was. I kind of was there for the early innings of its evolution, and just being able to shape that and
Yeah, yeah,
influence that
yeah.
in the past and into the future, it's very exciting. So yeah, I wouldn't be doing anything else at this point in my career. I think this is I've done other types of work in the past. I'm an engineer by trade. So I've done a lot of exciting engineering projects, but being able to shape something into existence, if you will. Because if you think about it, when we wrote EB 105, there was no standard,
There's no
right?
standards. Yeah.
We're not iterating on something that existed in the past. We have to create it from the ground up. And that kind of creation process, that birthing process, if you will, is exciting. And I just want to be here to allow my kid to go to college, essentially. So
That's true.
and that
Yep.
and that's the way I think about it. I want to see this ecosystem kind of grow and mature to a certain point. I want to be able to say I was a key contributor to its growth and so on. So that's exciting for me, and I'm fortunate enough to be able to do that on the in the public sector and helping define what the rules are and the guardrails are, and now transition that into the private sector where I can now start to operationalize a lot of those rules and implement them in the real world in a way that I think is scalable and sustainable and kind of have with and leverage the deep insights that I gained from my time at the FAA. So I'm fortunate to be able to do that, but it's exciting to me, and yeah, again, wouldn't be doing anything else.
Yeah, you said it really well. You're one of the, three, four, five people I love to hear from at the FAA, and I'm excited to see what you're going to be doing next. You also said two things that were really interesting. One of them is, when EB 105, the first one came out, or we were waiting for it, we were wondering how much of it were you going to be able to use from the heliport side of things, knowing fully well that vertipads have to be, well, the totally different ratings, right? Crash ratings are very different, and obviously, and all of that. But at the same time, thinking, well, ultimately a vertiport can be used by a helicopter. Theoretically, that shouldn't be a big problem. And you said another great thing when EASA and FAA finally said okay with that big H, which is internationally recognized everywhere around the world. That was a fantastic thing to do. And then mostly you said something that's really near and dear to me because I'm a big proponent of open standards and everything. I use Linux at home. I've been using it forever. Agnostic. Being agnostic is so important because it means that it's interoperable. We can have people from different companies come in and come out. The only big problem that we have is the logistics side of things, obviously, which makes sense. I mean, I am recording on an Apple right now. There's definitely value to a closed source system when it's really nicely done, but it's a big world out there and everything. One thing, what I just realized we didn't touch on, but this is an open invitation to have you back whenever you want, is the energy equation. That's something that I'm always very excited about. Traveled all over the world. I've asked utilities the same question, and it turns out that nobody can give us generate the amount of electricity or transport the amount of electricity we will be needing. But that's something I look forward to asking you on the next podcast. But
Sure.
the last question that I have is, what would you like our readers to walk away from with today? What would be that one message that you think that they really need to understand from everything that we've talked about?
I think as you think about this ecosystem, and I think about my career at the FAA and the role I'm transitioning to, I think the true line for me through EB 105, EB 105A, the performance-based AC I'm working on now, and the next chapter is that when we think of design, we need to design for flexibility, right? Designing for flexibility is key. I think you pointed to some things that are of utmost importance is interoperability, not making sure that our rules don't get in the way and stifle innovation, that we just
Yep.
create a framework that allows innovation to thrive, and that's important. But we also need to regulate for performance, right? We don't want to be overly prescriptive in how we think about our standards and our regulations around this. We want to make sure that it's driven by performance outcomes, and then allow industry to tailor solutions that best meet those outcomes based on the vehicle performance and then the environments in which those vehicles would operate in. And I think flexibility in design, performance is one, and then also lastly, we're building for trust, and that cannot
Yep.
be lost in this equation,
Yep.
right? So if we're designing and we're regulating, but we don't have the public trust, right? Again, we're missing the mark. So I think those three things: design for flexibility, regulate for performance, and build for trust. Those three things are the true lines, I think, are most important as I think about the evolution of my career, and I think, and as also the evolution of the industry, and I want that not to be lost on anyone listening to this. Those are the three things I would hold most paramount.
Yeah, you said it really well, especially in this crucial moment. And disruptive technologies go through more or less the same parallels, but this is a crucial moment where we cannot have a single accident. It's just that simple. We really need to. And again, aviation. Anybody who works in aviation, their first thought of the day is safety. Their middle thought of the day is safety. Their last thought of the day is safety. That's just what it is. So we need the public to make sure that they're happy flying on an airplane the way they will be wanting to do it on an eVTOL, on an eSTOL, on an eCTOL. So I think you said it really well.
That tension that people try to point to between flexibility and safety, I think it's not a tension. I think they're enablers of each other,
Yeah.
and
Oh,
we
yeah,
have
you're
to kind
right.
of hold up both, like flexibility and innovation, and safety as the guiding principle. Those go hand in hand, and they work in tandem.
Absolutely. No, I think they're complementary. You said it very well, and that's a very good point to be made here. Robert, again, thank you for being here. Thank you for your announcement. We're really honored to have that on our first here or scoop on the podcast. Again, an open invitation to come back whenever you want. Maybe once you made your transition, you can tell us where you are, what you're doing. We'd love to hear from you. There's still a few things I wanted to, 45 minutes is never long enough, but energy, where do you think it's happening? Where will it take off next? We never talked about Asia and MENA and all these other areas that are so crucial to advanced air mobility. But those are the questions I look forward to asking you next time. And for those of you listeners and watchers out there, thank you for being with us today. Thank you for listening to Robert. Robert has an incredible amount of experience when it comes to advanced air mobility. He's one of my top people to listen to at the FAA. I always enjoy hearing what he has to say. So our question is, what did you learn? What do you understand now? Maybe hopefully a little bit better than you didn't before. How do you see your future with advanced air mobility? How will it work? And again, subscribe, share, like, tell us what you think, and we look forward to seeing you next week again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks for having me.